Greetings, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to pick up where we left off, reading in Brothers and Warriors, Book 1 in the Patriots of the American Revolution series by yours truly, of course. And you'll notice, perhaps I got me some brand new reading spectacles. They're a little bit better prescription for me. But we are going to continue with Chapter 2, which is entitled Volunteers. The call-up did not come as early as everyone expected. Patriot spies in South Carolina kept a relatively constant stream of news about British movements flowing northward. It seemed that their main goal was to solidify their gains around Charlestown and slowly begin their pacification of the outlying areas. There were scant few Tories in Mecklenburg County, but stories began to circulate about British sympathizers from South Carolina making forays across the border. Supposedly, a few homes had been burned. It was reported by some that men loyal to the Patriot cause were snatched from their beds in the dark of night, never to be heard from again. But no one could ever seem to give the exact name of those men or where they lived, so the rumors didn't take much root. There were, however, reliable reports about Tories becoming more active in some North Carolina counties in the Northwest and just across the border into South Carolina. For the first week after the fall of Charlestown, most people stayed pretty close to home. Women and children stayed indoors. The men worked their fields, tended their livestock, and operated as normally as possible. The one exception was that men and boys of a reasonable age were armed at all times. Muskets and rifles were kept within constant reach. But after the initial spasms of fear waned, people began to wander a little further from home, and in pretty short order, the normal flow of life and commerce resumed. By the following Sunday, life seemingly returned to normal, including the Sunday routine of attending church meeting. It was that first Sunday meeting after the fall of Charlestown that the war hit a little closer to home. The shock came in the form of a message delivered by a kindly-looking gentleman that the Hamilton boys had never seen before. Immediately after the opening prayer, Elder William Scott announced that they had a guest and invited the man to stand and speak. The man appeared somewhat somber. Brothers and sisters, I am Thomas Crawford of the Waxhaws Presbyterian Church, just across the border in South Carolina. It is with a heavy heart that I come before you today. This past Thursday evening, ruffians with sympathies to King George forced their way into the home of Mr. Edward McClelland, a fine, hard-working, God-fearing man of our faith. According to his precious wife, they demanded payment for his so-called traitorous sons, two of whom were captured and imprisoned at Charlestown. When he informed them that he had neither any money to give nor the inclination to give any to thieves in the night, the Tories dragged him into the woods beside his barn and hanged him. In cold blood, they murdered an unarmed man. Well, the congregation was visibly shaken. Several of the women wept. Men murmured in a mixture of anger and fear. John looked at his brother James and saw him clenching his fist and pounding them on his knees. His temples were pulsating. Crawford continued, I come to this congregation today to beg its kindness and generosity in a spirit of Christian charity to offer relief to Brother McClelland's poor widow. She is now alone with 5 children in her charge, with no help possible from her 2 grown sons, now suffering in the British jail in Charlestown. Waxhaw's Church has dispatched envoys to our sister congregations throughout the region. They sent me hither to ask whatever support you might offer to this destitute woman, be it foodstuffs, supplies, funds, or labor on her farm. We entreat you to open your hearts and pantries and be a blessing to this woman. Turning to the elder, he concluded, Elder Scott, I am most grateful for this opportunity to speak to you and your congregation. I trust that God's will shall be revealed and obeyed." Well, clearly finished with his speech, the visiting leader turned very slowly and deliberately and sat down on the front row bench. Elder Scott rose in his place to speak. "Brother Crawford, we are grateful for your presence today and for bringing this dire need to our attention. Our hearts are broken for the widow McClellan and her family. Obviously, this is a need that demands our utmost attention. We shall commit the matter to prayer today so that it might provide the way for a greater opportunity for deliberate generosity. And we will gather here again as a church late on Thursday afternoon, the day after tomorrow, 1 hour before sundown, for the sole purposes of prayer and giving. On that evening, we will pray for our brethren and collect the offering that God wills for us to share with this family." Nods and murmurs of affirmation pulsated throughout the tent. The elder continued, "Once the offering is collected, we will dispatch men on Wednesday morning to deliver such gifts as we receive. All we need right now are men to volunteer for this humanitarian mission. Gentlemen, who will hearken to the call of the word of God and answer, 'Here am I, send me'?" Well, silence ensued. As the good elder scanned the room, he met the expectant eyes of the women and the downcast stares of the men. Few seemed to be willing to make eye contact. Clearly, none of them had any desire whatsoever to leave their homes and families with the cloud of war's uncertainty hanging over the entire land. But in a matter of moments, John felt a sudden movement beside him as his brother James rose to his feet. "Elder, if the church is agreeable, it would be an honor for myself and my brothers, Johnny and William, to take those supplies and gifts on Wednesday. We're at a good stopping point on our farm, so we can afford a few days away. It might take a full day or a day and a half with a loaded wagon. Then maybe we could help out on the McClellan place for a couple of days, worship with the good folks at the Waxhaws Church on the Lord's Day, and then head back home on that afternoon. We should be able to make it back home on Monday evening, Lord willing." "Hear, hear," came a shout from the back, followed by a chorus of amens that was pretty raucous for a Presbyterian gathering. Mr. Scott replied, "James, we are humbled by you boys' offer, and we gratefully accept. Brother Crawford, does such an arrangement seem agreeable to you?" Thomas Crawford stood and replied, "It does indeed, sir. We will prepare for their arrival and have lodging arranged at the McClellan farm. I stand humbled and most grateful." Well, John didn't remember much after that exchange. His mind was awash with visions of travel and adventure. Other than his early childhood in Pennsylvania, he had never been outside of Mecklenburg County, and here he was, headed into the Tory-infested backwoods of South Carolina. Sure, it was just barely across the border, but it was South Carolina. The war was there. He shivered with excitement. After the church gathering, it took the boys a full half hour just to get back to their wagon and start heading for home. The short walk was cluttered with interruptions. The men shook their hands and slapped their backs. The women doted over them and promised to help fix them up right for such a journey. The girls swooned, especially Mary Skillington. John thought that her face might split wide open if she smiled any wider and batted her eyes at him any harder. But at long last, they finally made it to the wagon and began slowly rolling toward home. They all felt pretty satisfied with themselves, even young William, who still didn't quite understand what he had been volunteered to do. Nevertheless, the pride was contagious. Well, Monday and Tuesday were filled with the flurry of activity. Even though, as James shared at church, they were in a bit of a quiet lull on the farm, there still were the basic chores to attend to. All of their crops were in the ground, and the corn had been chopped and weeded just that past week. But there were livestock to tend, fences to mend, and the everyday mundane tasks to accomplish. Visitors appeared at the farm almost hourly to drop off items for the collection. James had not thought of such a possibility, but after the first couple of unexpected visitors, he set aside some room in the barn to make a stack of goods. Clearly, not everyone was planning to attend the Tuesday evening prayer meeting, but it seemed like most of the local folk were still wanting to help through giving. By late Tuesday, there was a considerable pile of corn, syrup, salt, bedding, and deer hides. There were bags full of cornmeal and flour, small kegs of lard, jugs and jars of sundry food items, some smoked hams, sides of Midland meat, along with several boxes and bundles of unknown items wrapped in cloth or brown paper. Several items of old, outgrown, and discarded clothing for children began to collect in a separate pile. A few of the visitors handed James money for the destitute family, but not many of them did so, and in the end it did not amount to much. He accumulated a humble collection of copper and silver coins minted in various nations throughout Europe, but mostly British coppers and little slivers and pie-cut pieces of Spanish milled dollars. Their neighbors also brought a few items for the boys themselves. These were mainly gifts of dried beef and venison, nuts, and dried fruit for the journey. James was dumbfounded when his stepfather appeared late on Tuesday and delivered not only a basket of food from their mother, but also 3 horns full of gunpowder and an ample supply of lead and patches for all their weapons. He was touched by the gift, but he still didn't care one bit for old Ephraim Farr. The boys loaded up and headed for the church tent as the hour drew nigh for the planned meeting. As James suspected, there were not many people present for the called meeting. Perhaps half of the membership was in attendance. But those who did come brought similar gifts to those dropped off earlier in the week. Their supply of goods was doubled, and their money supply tripled. After all the gifts were loaded in the wagon, the members gathered around the Hamilton boys and blessed them with a prayer. The boys hurried home to prepare themselves for the next day's journey. It took them 2 hours by candle and lamplight to load the wagon and get everything covered by canvas. It was way past their normal bedtime when they all tumbled into their corn-shuck beds. They planned to rise early for the journey, but John didn't care. He was so excited that he had serious doubts as to whether he could sleep at all. He eventually drifted off, dreaming about the exotic wilderness of South Carolina and the marauding redcoats that were sure to be waiting there. He was awakened as his bed shook beneath him. James stood over his bed in the darkness, holding a beeswax candle in his hand and vigorously kicking the leg of his corn-shuck bed. "I'm awake, James! Stop your kicking!" Wednesday had arrived. Finally, an adventure. John jumped up quickly from his bed and pulled on his breeches. As he stretched his wool stockings across his feet, he noticed a cream-colored mass stretched across the chair beside his bed. The mixture of pre-dawn darkness and cloudy eyes from sleep made it difficult for him to see the mysterious object on the chair. He reached out, and his hands touched soft buckskin. Along the side, he felt a row of rough-cut buttons, most likely wafers of deer antler. "What's this, James?" he queried. "Oh, I had a cut of that buckskin leather left over and thought I would make you some new leggings," he replied. "Them old gray wool ones of yours wore plumb out. I measured them off to your other set and made them to strap on nice and tight with them deer antler buttons. I hope you like them. A man setting off into the wilderness needs him a good set of leggings." Well, John's eyes swelled a bit, almost to the point of tears. James had given him a man-sized gift. These were garments that he had spent untold hours preparing, cutting, and sewing. John didn't know what to say, so he plainly and simply responded, "Much obliged, James. I'll wear 'em proud." He partially buttoned his soft, supple new leggings and pulled them up over his socks until they reached just above the cuff of his breeches. They were sized perfectly, hitting right at the knee. James equipped them properly with a leather strap on the outside hips that would tie off to his belt and ensure that his leggings would not sag and gather. Finally, John slipped on his black buckle shoes and secured the bottoms of 3 buttons to the outside of those leggings. A thick piece of leather slipped perfectly under the arch of his front heel and secured to the bottom button. It was a perfect fit. The buckskin was soft and thick. It was one of the nicest gifts that John had ever received from anyone. As John finished getting dressed, William also began to stir in his cot on the other side of the cabin. James had been a little less violent in his efforts to wake the lad. John went over and helped his little brother get dressed and gather his personal bag and gear. The Hamilton boys wolfed down a cold breakfast of biscuits and salt pork, washed down with tepid milk. James had milked their cow and fed the chickens for the final time before their trip. His younger, far half-brothers were responsible for the twice daily milking, livestock feeding, and gathering of eggs whilst they were gone. James hitched the horses, while John and William filled their 3 wooden canteens and 4 large beeswax-sealed gourds with fresh water and stashed them in the few available nooks and hollows that were still in the wagon. Finally, they all loaded and primed their flintlocks and climbed up onto the seat of the wagon just as the dull glow of sunrise began to creep over the eastern ridge. James pointed the team southward toward Charlottetown, and their great adventure began. Well, we'll stop right there. That's part 1 of chapter 2. And next time, we'll pick right up where we left off and finish and see what happens to those Hamilton boys down in South Carolina. I thank you for visiting and for listening.